Okay, so hello and welcome to expanding our conversation, Asian American experience. Since it's Asian American Heritage Month, we thought we would do our conversation on Asian Americans, specifically mostly Western and Southern Asian Americans, since there's such a broad spectrum of their experience. So the kind of question we're phrasing is, how are we called to love, serve, and advocate for our Asian American and Pacific Islander siblings in Christ? So, how do we use the knowledge we have to move forward? Um, so, I have a prayer that Maria is going to do, but first, I have some centering words. These are in Korean. So, the Korean is gosen kuten da ki onda, which in Korean means at the end of hardship there is hope. Which I feel like is a good way of centering our conversation, giving the experiences that our Asian American siblings are going through at the moment. So our prayer is for courage to do that, for courage to do justice.
Let us pray. O Lord, open our eyes that we may see the needs of others. Open our ears that we may hear their cries. Open our heart so that they need not be without succor. Let us not be afraid to defend the weak because of the anger of the strong, nor afraid to defend the poor because of the anger of the rich. Show us where love and hope and faith are needed, and use us to bring them to those places. And so open our eyes and our ears that we may this coming day be able to do some work of peace for you. Amen.
Amen.
It's beautiful.
So another thing that I wanted was to just kind of frame why we're doing this. So Ben Franklin once said, "Justice will not be served until those who are unaffected are as outraged as those who are." And so this kind of statement is driving why we're doing the conversations on race and culture, really advocating that if we who are not affected as white Christians living in the Andover, Anoka, Coon Rapids suburb are not outraged, then who will? So moving forward, we're going to discuss the history that the Asian American Pacific Islander people have experienced in America, as well as the experiences they're having today, and how we as Christians can move forward. So these are the ground rules. There are no experts. Assume positive intent. Pay attention to how you're feeling. It's okay to experience different emotions throughout this process. This is a safe space for multiple perspectives, and then confidentiality. So whatever is said in this room stays in this room. So the first thing I want us to do is to think about what stereotypes we have in our own lives and in our culture about Asian Americans, and then to think about the first time you met someone of Asian descent and what happened and how you felt. So just take a minute or two to kind of brainstorm those ideas, and then we'll have a conversation about it. And so these images were created by Asian Americans this past year about the stereotypes that they think they experience. And so the one that stuck out to me was the Ann Castro picture. And these are the things that she thinks young Asians, she's Filipina, see themselves as. And so she talked with a bunch of young Asians in her community, and these are the things that they think people think they are, rather than their history. And she writes in a lot of her posts on Instagram about their forgotten history. How a lot of Asian Americans don't know their own history, and they don't know the experiences they've struggled with. So one thing I really want to do tonight is really identify who are, the next thing we're going to identify is who are the AAPI, or the Asian American Pacific Islander people, and what does that have to do with Minnesota? Because I feel like even though Diane had a friend who living in Coon Rapids who was Asian, we think, oh, we're in northern suburbia, Minnesota. We are not diverse. The only differences we have is whether we're Swedish or Norwegian. Um, and so just seeing that impact. So the term Asian American and Pacific Islander encompasses these entire regions that I've shown on our slide. So the entirety of the Pacific Islands, except for Australia and New Zealand, they identify as their own people group. And then all of Asia from European Russia over. And so it's a lot of people that we really don't think of, like Middle Eastern people and like the Southern Pacific Islands, and just seeing how diverse these cultures are in their presentation from the Pacific Islands to Northern Asia to Southern Asia in the islands. And so according to the US Census in 2000, the Asian American population was 10.2 million, making up 3.6% of the country's population. And they are the second fastest growing population in the United States after Latinos. And so we're seeing a huge increase in Asian American Pacific Islander people. So what a great opportunity to learn about them, because they're becoming part of our story in Minnesota as well. So moving forward, these are the breakdowns of people living in the United States. And it's good to point out on my right, I'm assuming it's your right too, that a lot of that list are immigrants. Well, they're all immigrants, but they're all refugees. So Hmong, Thai, Laotian, Taiwanese, Burmese, Mongolian, Bhutanese are all countries that are considered refugee status, as well as Vietnamese. So it's interesting to see how world history has affected our own history in America and the makeup of our people groups. And we're going to see on the next slide how Minnesota is also broken down. So we are the second largest population of Hmong people in the United States, second to California, third in Laotian, and then fifth in Burmese. And again, these big three are because they are political refugees. And so a lot of this list that make up the ethnic groups, we have Hmong, Burmese, Laotian, Taiwanese, Thai are all refugees. And so how Minnesota responded to the refugees after the Korean and Vietnam War and before that really has affected our story. There are entire sections of St. Paul where half of the directions and signage are in Thai or in English. And so it's really cool to see those Hmong markets and see how the groups of people coming to Minnesota especially have impacted the way that we present our information. So looking at this, you guys being this is your first time looking at it, was there anything that shocked you? Because I think these numbers are shocking sometimes because we don't really see them, like you don't think of this percentage of numbers, like the second largest number of Hmong people in the United States. Is that shocking to you guys? And what's your reaction to these statistics on these last 2 pages? 3. And then another thing to point out that not only the Hmong people are a huge percentage in our population in Minnesota, but also the Karen people. And a lot of these, they identify as Karen secondary to another ethnic group. So they might be Thai and Karen, or Taiwanese and Karen, or Laotian and Karen. And so some of these groups are multi-ethnic as well, which is cool to see how those cultures have also blended. So I think we need to realize where we're coming from in order to move forward and also take a step back. So we've seen in the past couple months, because of COVID, because of economic hardship, that the Asian American people are getting really hit hard with hate crimes. And so since the March of 2020, more than 3,000 incidences of hate-related incidences. So either hate speech or violence have been reported to AAPI hate, and about 60% of them are women that have been hated. A stereotype in the Asian American community is that women are weak and that they are to be used. And so a lot of these organizations have reported that a lot of these incidences are women and older women. So attacking the elders of the community, which they will address in some of the things that I'm talking about. And so Amanda Nguyen is a huge leader in the End AAPI Hate campaign, and I think her quote really helps frame what's happening. When you other a group of people, there's a higher chance of violence towards those people. So when you separate someone based on anxieties or feelings of fear that you have, then violence grows because you try to scapegoat. A fact that I do want to point out that's really kind of scary to think is that there were 3 incidences of AAPI hate in New York City in 2019. In 2020, March was the latest data. They're up to 28 already, and they don't have the full year. And so it's increasing at a astronomical rate. It's up 149% in more than a dozen of these cities. They recorded in 2 weeks in New York that every about day and a half they were getting an incident report. And the worst part is most of these incident reports were seen by bystanders. And people aren't sharing as much as they think. A lot of these programs have shown that the violence is probably more than these numbers show. However, people do not report because nothing is done. Because in order to charge as a hate crime in most of these cities, you need to show intent, and it's really difficult to show that. So the picture on the side is a memorial that was made after the Atlanta shooting. And I just looked at the Twitter feed, and this is still standing. So this is the 4th month, I believe, their 3rd month where this is still standing. So the impact of these hate crimes and of these reports has a huge impact on the community. And it's a shared history that I think gets forgotten. And I think that we need to bring light to these incidences. So now that we know what's happening today, I think we need to take a step back and understand the history. So the way that I see it is to move forward in the future, we must understand the past. A lot of the historians that I've been reading have really echoed this point. And I think that some of these events will be shocking. They're not taught in school. I had to do a lot of research to realize these. And it's a moment where I had to really understand my own bias in history and what voices are being silenced. So, despite stereotypes, the Asian American community has been here for a long time. That's something that I really had to address while making these slides and really doing my research. And so the Chinese immigrants sought work in the gold mines in the West. And so they immigrated as a way to send money back to China due to China's economic downfall. And so over a fifth of the workers on the California gold mine were Chinese, which may not seem like a lot given the small population, but they were seen as a threat. They were seen as dirty, uncivilized, and sent by the communists to destroy our economy. So we see that cycling pattern of blaming another group on economic downfall. And by the time the gold rush was done, about 10% of the population of California was Chinese or Japanese. And so they were entire building Chinatowns so that people could see their own culture and really connect with home, because a lot of these were, as we see in our picture, young men who were here alone wanting to connect with other people. And these young men being in a new town, being in a new culture, kind of led to some skirmishes in their dealings with other Chinese Americans as well as the whites. And so this led to the Chinese massacre of 1871. It is the largest lynching in US history to this date. 19 people were killed, the youngest being a 14-year-old boy, the oldest being almost a 6-year-old doctor. And then after they were lynching them wherever they could, one document I read said that they turned over a person's car and decided to start killing them at that moment. And then after they killed them, they burned their houses to remove the evidence. And so the picture below is a picture that was presented at the Chinese History Museum showing the kind of conflict of the blooming Chinatown that stands there today versus the destroyed buildings of the 1871 massacre. And ironically, the place where the lynchings took place is where the Department of Justice building sits in LA. And so it's ironic and sad to see that a giant building that stands for justice and peace in California is where many Chinese Americans were murdered.
And I don't want to interrupt here, but the largest lynching in US history, Minnesota had a lynching of 38 Indian people right after the Dakota War. So maybe they really mean the largest lynching of Chinese people.
The statistic that they were using was by state officials. And so this lynching was began by the sheriff and the county rather than lay people. And so that clarity makes it even more gross to think about that this was started by the public officials in the area. And so Kevin Waite of the California Museum describes the Chinese American rebuild as this. They rebuilt much of what they lost and resisted repeated calls for their removal. Their very presence sent an undeniable message. The mob had failed and they would remain. And so parts of that Chinatown in California still stands. And so it's a horrific event, but it also speaks to the resiliency of these people and the resiliency we're going to see through history of people standing up against hate in their community. And then following the Chinese massacre, to make matters worse, within that time, Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans were not allowed to testify in court. And so if these hate crimes were documented, too bad. Unless a white person was willing to testify, your case was dropped and you were allowed to either move or just deal with it. And so the Chinese Exclusion Act stated this: US federal law that was the first, it's the US federal law that was the first and only major federation legislation to explicitly suspend immigration for specific nationality. So Chinese immigrants cannot be naturalized or allowed to immigrate to the US. And they only apologized in the 70s. So this is the only Exclusion Act on documentation that specifically targets a certain group of people. And it's because the Chinese population was, according to the documentation, this is the actual wordage, getting out of control. And so they decided to exclude them. So this is what the History Channel states, which I think is a good summary of the impact on that Exclusion Act. Although the Chinese compose only 0.002% of the nation's population, the Congress passed the Exclusion Act to placate work demands and prevent concerns about maintaining white racial purity. And so this is the beginnings of their history. Coming to America for a new life, to send money home, to build their culture. And then within 100 years, there's multiple instances of racially based hate crimes and legislation And so some of these events are known, but the events moving forward are ones that history tends to forget. So the next big impact on the Asian American experience in history was the Japanese internment camps during World War II. So during World War I, the view of Asian American people was seen as the Oriental snake, is a lot of what the documentation calls them. That don't trust them, they'll take your job, they'll take your culture, and then they'll eradicate your country, is what a lot of the documentation and propaganda of World War I said about these people. And then the War Relocation Authority was created, and to take all people of Japanese descent into custody, surround them with troops, prevent them from buying land, and return them to their former homes at the close of the war. The ending part of that statement wasn't very true. A lot of those homes were raided or bombed or destroyed. So families would go home to rubble. One of the, I think, most devastating stories I read was a Korean American family was rounded up because they looked Japanese, they looked the part. And so their daughter grew up speaking Japanese rather than Korean because she didn't know who she was, just because they were all taken. And more than 120,000 Japanese Americans were taken and placed in 5 camps around the US. That number is an estimate because some of the older Japanese Americans were killed because of the conditions. And so it's a really dark moment in history of seeing that present because of the perceived hate and racial stereotypes of the people. And most of them in a lot of the documentation say, I've never been to Japan. I'm American. I was born here. And we're going to see that pattern repeated. And then this is where a lot of current history is starting to be shaped. The Immigration Exclusion Act of 1965. So immigration was not based on race, but rather one of those with close relatives or skills that were in short supply. So doctors, engineers, artisans, people who were seen as better than the working class. And then this would perpetuate the model minority myth that Japanese people are hardworking, that they can beat the system, that they can make a lot of money, that they're doctors, that they fight for their dreams. And it's true, Japanese or Asian Americans are the highest income in ethnic minority groups, but that's because of what sociologists call the bottom barrel philosophy, that you don't want to be the bottom. You do everything you can to fight to get to the top. And so through that inherent racism, other groups are pushed to the bottom. And so this model minority myth not only hurts relationships between Asian Americans and other minorities, but Asian Americans and whites. And so it's good to note that this is a huge part of some tension between groups. And so the graph that you see here is the immigration law and how many immigrants came during that Exclusion Act. And a lot of the immigrants we have today following the Korean and Vietnam War and the 1965 Exclusion Act shape the populations in history we have today. I have students whose grandparents were a part of this act because they were artisans or they were doctors or they had family here or they were refugees. And so this is really shaping the population we have and really kind of seeing how these laws not only show the stereotypes and prejudices that were seen towards Asian Americans, but also how their story has been shaped and how they've made their presence known in our country. And then the next thing I'm going to talk about is probably one of the saddest parts of the Asian American history that I have read. And and it was the murder of Vincent Chin in the 80s. So Vincent Chin was a Chinese American man who was going to a club for his bachelor party, and he was beaten to death in Detroit by two white men. They beat him. What they told the courts was because of the automotive recession in Detroit, and that he looked Japanese, so he needed to die. Both men, over the course of the history of the courts, were cleared of all charges and walked away with nothing. His mom talks about the fact that she paid more in travel, court expenses, and funeral costs than she was given at his hearing. So she had nothing for the death of her son. And this caused outrage in the Japanese American community, the Chinese American community, and the Asian American community as a whole. This event led to the creation of Asians for Justice, which is a advocacy group that fights hate crimes. And a lot of, like, when I was reading this event, it really pointed me to this picture that we see. This is the protest in San Francisco, Justice for Vincent Chin. And then the next picture next to it is George Floyd. And so seeing how the murder of an innocent man can cause outrage in a community and spark change. And so seeing that dichotomy really brought a light to, this isn't just one people group, that racism affects all people. And so William Scott Downey, who's a lawyer, said law without justice is a wound without a cure. And it really speaks to the impact of these trials. And so Lily Chin is his mom, and she wrote, "I lost everything. How can I live in America with that kind of law?" And there are still people who are fighting for justice for this case because, again, they had nothing. And so Helen Zia, who wrote one of the books that was my main resource, was at the event. She was part of the Asian American Justice Initiative, and she wrote this about being at that event, which really touched my heart because this really shows the impact of the ripple effect. Theirs was the classic immigrant story of survival. Work hard and sacrifice for the family, keep a low profile, don't complain, and perhaps in the next generation attain the American dream. For Asian Americans, along with the dream came the hope of one day gaining acceptance in America. The injustice surrounding Vincent's slaying shattered that dream. So she talks about how that moment, a lot of Asian Americans realized that we don't fit in. We're not this model minority, and people still will hurt us because we're different. And a lot of the anti-protests that happened at this event were, go back to China and this will all be solved, is what they would tell them. Or you're a foreigner, why should we care? And so this, reading his story and researching his story really showed me that there is a dark past, even in the closer to present history, that is still being experienced by the Asian American community. And that the events of 2020 regarding the hate crimes around COVID are not new. And that these are stories that need to be told. And that this is not a story that a lot of people know. And so I've included in our resources PowerPoint a documentary about his story, just so people can really experience and understand more about what happened. And then kind of more modern history. I'm gonna have to move you guys so I can see. How is our understanding of history shaped by our experience and memories? And so this is a picture of the LA riots. And so during the LA riots, the Koreatown was burned because a Black woman was killed. And so, Dad, are you seeing if you can know where that is? Yeah. um, and so this is a time where I wasn't, but a lot of people were alive to know. And so what do you if you remember the LA riots, what do you remember, and how has that kind of shaped your history and your understanding of the past? And so something that is to be noted is that this experience, there's still tension between the Koreans and the Blacks in California. And so it's terrifying to see how these acts of hatred can lead to other groups being pitted against each other. And so we can see that today. Um, and it's important to understand this history because then we understand how to interact with people moving forward and how the scars of the past can still be open wounds for people. And so this is today. People are honestly sick and tired of it. And so this group here is called Activists for Asian Americans, and they are a community watch group that 24 hours a day during the attacks in Chinatown in New York, they patrolled the streets, making sure that Asian women could get to the store, that kids could go to school, that people could live their normal lives and not live in fear of being attacked. And so hence the orange. People in this group wore orange as a way to signify not only a beacon of hope, but also a stand together in the Asian community. So Adrian De Leon is a professor from California, and he says this about what's happening. Part of the problem is people saying this could never happen in America. The rest of us whose communities have suffered this can imagine it happening. This is the manufactured historical ignorance that allows this nativism, racism, and contemporary violence to fester. And so people are taking a stand. People across the United States are taking a stand against Asian hate, against Black hate. And so moving forward, we're going to see what people are doing, and then we're going to talk about what we can do. So how are people advocating now? Through education, advocation, and change. So this is an image that was drawn over quarantine by an Asian American artist in New York. And so this is her project that she really focused on. So what feelings or ideas come to you when you look at this image? The first thing that I noticed was the koi fish, and in Japanese culture, koi symbolize the balance of peace, the balance of light and dark, and the image of that everything, it's their definition of the yin yang, is that it's the animalistic symbol. And so I thought it was cool that there will be balance, that in love, there is conquered hate. And so that's the first thing that I noticed, understanding that piece of history. So what do you guys think of or feel when you look at this image? And so people are responding. This picture made me hopeful and sad. This little girl and father made these signs for a Stop Asian Hate protest, and she's 5. So this is her first protest. And so just seeing how families are coming together, so that he wrote when they interviewed him, I just want my baby girl to live in a place where she's loved. And so just like that feeling that parents and families and advocates are coming together to end this hatred and this virus of hate. And so Amanda Wynn wrote, "Our stories matter. We see you, we hear you, and we're just getting started." And so she has a campaign on Instagram where people can reach out and they can document the experiences they've had of hate, just to raise awareness that these things are still happening. And then the middle image is one that's really powerful. That is Miss Universe from Taiwan. And so her entire dress says Stop Asian Hate. And that was her platform, using her presence in the beauty pageant to acknowledge her culture and like acknowledge the hate that is being experienced. And then the women from China, Japan, and the Philippines also demonstrated their advocacy for Asian American women, and just seeing that we are strong and we're here to stay. And so even in modern culture and in these kind of contests that are viewed all over the world, people are using that as a platform to end hate. And so these are some quotes that I have pulled from different authors about how they feel about the experience. And so Amanda Wynn writes, "The most powerful tool we have is our voice," which I think is a really good testimony of why we do things like this. Hearing these stories, telling the truth can really bring light. She also writes, "True peace can come when we hold a light to the darkest corner of our experiences." And I really like that image, especially being so close to Pentecost and so close to the Christian faith, that the light can drive out that darkness. And then Helen Zia writes, "We are called to have conversations with people because stories are empathy machines." The fact that reading these stories of Vincent Chin and the riots and in LA and the massacre that happened in California brought tears to me. It was a really difficult experience reading these stories and not being able to step back in that timeline and help. And so moving forward, I believe that when hearing those stories, we are called to help shape the stories of others in the future. And then Daniel Lee, who is a theologian, a pastor, writes this, which really shapes the Christian perspective as well. "With the eraser of history, we cannot see our neighbors well. We need to see both the history and the human in order to understand our differences." And so not whitewashing things or not colorblinding things, but acknowledging this history and moving forward, and calling others to really examine their own future. And that the advocacy we have changes lives. The fact that when people gathered for George Floyd, it made a difference. When people gathered for Vincent Chin, it made a difference. When people go to these anti-Asian hate rallies, it makes a difference. And so it really speaks this image of action over apathy. And so what can we do to help others? So what do we do next is the big question that we all ask. So like, we know the history, we're like, great. So what do we do? What impact can I make in my community in Minnesota? So Michelle Lee is an editor of Vogue, and I think she says it really beautifully. "Unfortunately, after this year of increased discrimination and attacks, and now the tragic loss of life in Atlanta, there's a lot of hurt and anger. So it is important that Asian Americans and our allies don't look at awareness as the solution when it is just a step towards getting there." So being aware of the history, being aware of the violence, but being aware and making a change are two very different, they're different steps in the same path moving forward. And so how can we at Grace, how can we in our community, and how can we as a whole advocate for Asian American people? And so one frame that I like is out of Stanford. And this is a frame that they use for teachers. And so one thing that I like to say to my students is that if kids can do it, adults can do it. And so the framework that they say is interrupt. Take a time out to end the comments that are racist or uneducated in that moment. We can report the violence and comments that we hear and see right away. This helps end the cycle of violence faced by our Asian American brothers and sisters or siblings. Question. This is the one that gets hard, because when we're having conversations with our friends or family or in our community, sometimes we hear people say things and we just move forward thinking that it'll be okay. But they ask us to question. We will ask questions of our peers when they have said something wrong or hurtful to learn about why they said it. Asking them to explain their reasoning can help acknowledge why it is so wrong. So one of the things they said was like, "Oh, the Chinese virus or the Kung flu." Like, why would you say that? Like, what makes you think that that's okay? Like those kind of questions that can make us feel really uncomfortable. As a person who does not like confrontation, this one scares me. But we need to step out of our comfort zone if that means advocating and ending violence facing our siblings. Educate. We will educate ourselves on the history of AAPI people, the long history of racism against them, and amplify the diverse narrative of different people groups. And then is in this presentation that we will send the concept of a single story. So Chimamanda Adichie talks about the danger of a single story. Not hearing diverse perspectives impacts the way that we see the true narrative. We don't have time today to watch that, but I will encourage you to watch it. The link is active. And then echo. I think this is something that we can do, everyone can do better, echoing. We will give space at the table for all people to speak and amplify the narratives that have been silenced, like the narrative of Vincent, the narrative of all those people who have been killed, whose stories have been lost to history. And then this is what they say about that. When someone else speaks up, echo them, thank them, and emphasize or amplify their message any way you can. This not only encourages more speaking up, it also ensures that no one thinks your silence in response to biased ideas or language means you're okay with it. And then echoing an Asian American history that has really caused a change, or an Asian American, he's not American, he's just Asian. Where there is love, there is life, by Gandhi. And this framework can work for all people. So next month we're talking about pride, and I think these interrupt, question, educate, and echo can be used when having conversations about anything, really creating a framework where we question comments that are hateful and we really step into a place of vulnerability in order to advocate and assist our siblings. And it can be scary. I will acknowledge that this process isn't easy, but one person, if you step into a conversation or you step into a comment of hate, can kind of spark that conversation. One of my favorite podcasts says, white people need to talk to white people because white people listen to white people, which honestly, it's true. And so like when we step into these conversations with our peers and our church and our community, then we can kind of create these kind of breaks in the racist rhetoric that might be not even intentional. Like some of the stereotypes we hold aren't even intentional, but they're still damaging. So I have some questions for us to discuss. So what is something surprising or new you learned this evening? What questions do you still have? I don't have the answers, but it's good to question. I'd like to clarify that. What ways can we, Grace, our communities, and our cities help to advocate for AAPI siblings? And then how has God called you to think differently about serving the AAPI people in our world? So we'll have. Okay, so I'm going to read our prayer, but what centered around my prayer was these lanterns. So in Chinese, Korean, and Japanese cultures, those are the big three that use this during the Lunar Festival, the Lights Festival. The lantern is a symbol of new beginning, new hope, new exploration, and new life. And so I give this all to God. Pentecost being on Sunday, this transition of a new light and a new beginning is a really cool way to amplify using these information that we've been gathering and these conversations we've been having to bring new light to our understanding of the Asian Americans experience. So the Bible verse that kind of shaped this is Matthew 5:16. In the same way, let your light shine before others, and they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. I say parent, but we'll keep it that. And so here is our ending prayer, and then I have a blessing. God of light and lover of all people, thank you for being with us tonight as we discuss how to better amplify the voices of all your people. Help us to see your children with their unique stories and experiences. God of hope, you are the ultimate refuge for the broken, beaten, and lost. Help us to show the greatest love of all, the love of your Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. God, I ask that you fill everyone here with the light of empathy and the fire of wisdom to live your truth. In your precious and uplifting name. Amen. And so here's a closing blessing, but also join us June 23rd for conversations on race and culture. Well, Pride, because it's Pride Month. And so the closing blessing is in Mandarin. So the Mandarin is Churang Ping which means may you have peace wherever you go. And so this is what grandparents and parents, they touch the forehead of their children and they say it after the lunar festival so that the child moving forward can have peace and light moving into the next part of their journey. So thank you.